The book is about growing up and the fine balance of growing up in India. And you can see a child balancing on the stick. So we're talking about a fine balance now, growing up between the ears, and what it means to have balance of hearing between the ears. Now let me just see if I have the mechanism to move on. Okay, good. So we have a wonderful team back at the Hospital for Sick Children, so I want to acknowledge them before I say anything more. And I want to ask you, first of all, when I'm speaking to you, which ear do you hear me in? So really, when we have normal hearing, it's indistinguishable. You hear with both ears so well that when you're listening on the telephone, with one ear, you almost have to suppress the other ear. You have to press the other side so that it doesn't bother you, so you can focus the attention to the telephone. And it's because our auditory pathways integrate the two ears so that it's a seamless integration. And that's what we want to create for children who are deaf by placing 2 cochlear implants, 1 in each ear. But we have a problem. We have lots of problems. One, we have electrical stimulation, not sound. That's a problem. We have 2 independent devices. That's a problem. And unfortunately for you, I'm not going to discuss those problems today. But I'm going to concentrate on the other problem, and that is that these children they were not born with hearing. And what we have this issue that we are going to stimulate, in some cases, one side before the other when we provide these cochlear implants sequentially. And our hypothesis is when we do that, we set up an asymmetric development that will be of concern to binaural hearing that we will not be able to recover from. And that's what we're going to discuss today. So the basic model, a very simplistic model of binaural hearing that's set up not by me but by Growth and colleagues, is that the symmetry between the 2 binaural pathways is very important for what the binaural system really does, which is to code spatial sound. So that when sound is coming from one side, we have each part of the pathway which receives, importantly, both excitatory and inhibitory input. And in this model, very simplistic, we would have input coming from one side, and the contralateral pathway would have an excitatory response met with an equal but opposite response from the other side, and that we would have, as sound moves toward the midline, a decreasing excitation with this increasing excitation until we meet the middle in midline of equal excitation. And you need a balanced, symmetric system for that to happen properly. And that's our objective, is to reach this kind of situation with 2 implants. And to meet this with development along the pathways. To study this, we have 2 basic groups of children. Those children who receive 2 cochlear implants at the same time, simultaneously. And you can see we have a large number. This was data that we compiled in the summer, so we have more. But you can see that our objective is to always implant early. We already know bilateral implantation. We have to restrict the period of bilateral deafness. We know that. We have to implant early. And another group is implantation, the first ear implanted again early to restrict the duration of bilateral deprivation. and then the second one implanted months or many years later. So we're studying these children. So the first thing that we noticed is, well, how are these children using spatial cues? And this is a simple test we can do by producing a noise and a speech sound from the front and asking children, well, what's the detection of that noise? And then providing a spatial cue by moving the speech sound, or moving, the noise to one side and the other, and seeing if there's a benefit to the spatial the detection of that speech sound. And in fact, children with normal hearing have a benefit. They use that spatial cue to detect the speech sound more easily. And they do that, they have an improvement in the thresholds by 9 decibels. So they're really using those spatial cues very well, whether you move the sounds to the noise to the, in this case, to the left or to the right. And children who receive simultaneous implants do this, and it's not significantly different in their performance. But you can see the sequential group has a poorer performance. They are receiving benefit, but it's not as great. And here's what the most interesting thing to me is the asymmetry. So when we move the noise toward the first implanted side, they are receiving less benefit of the spatial cue than when you move the noise away. So there's a dominance of the first implanted side. And this asymmetry is what we're really interested in. Where does it come from? The first hint is from our brainstem responses. And what you see here is when we measure brainstem responses from each side, the first implanted side and the second implanted side, you see the second implanted side lags behind in latency. And we know that the latency is a marker for development. In a study we did many years ago, when you track the latency of this auditory brainstem response with the first implant, you see decreasing latencies over the very first year of implant use. A very quick change, which reflects changing synaptic development mostly. It's an improvement at quicker synaptic change or transmission of information through the brainstem, a marker of development. And what's important here is it happens quickly. So that if we look at children implanted for much longer, over a decade of unilateral implant use, you can see that these latencies are not significantly different than those we measured only a year after implant use. So much of this development is already complete by a year after implant use. And that's very important, because what we think is you might have missed this very important developmental period if you allow the system to develop with one ear and then you choose to implant the second ear after this time. So let's say 2 years later, and you have this asymmetry. Does it resolve? Well, for children implanted beyond that time frame of that development, that asymmetry persists, whereas children for whom the second implant was received within that year of brainstem development, that asymmetry resolves. For children who received their 2 implants simultaneously, they never had this asymmetry in development, and you don't see it at the beginning and you don't see it later after bilateral implant use. Now we looked cortically for this evidence of asymmetry, and we're looking at children here who have an immature cortical response that is dominated by this large positive peak here. And here what you see, we use a beamformer to localize responses to the auditory cortex, left and right, and you see the responses in the voxel with the largest signal-to-noise ratio in children with normal hearing. Children who used a right unilateral cochlear implant received at young ages with nothing on the other side, and they'd used it for on average 7 years. Children who received simultaneous bilateral implants at young ages, had used them for, on average, just over 3 years. Children who received sequential implants, the first one on the right at a young age, and then received the left implant at months or years later, and now we're looking at them after having used both implants for 3.5 years on average later. And here's the data in each auditory cortex. The normal hearing children first. And what I'm plotting for you here are the dipoles of activity in each auditory cortex, measured in dipole moments over latency. And what I'm plotting down here are the maximum dipoles, and you can see that the morphology of the response is like that immature response, and they're very similar regardless of the hemisphere or the side of stimulation. And you can see that, as Andre Kral was showing you, that we have crossing of pathways mostly to the contralateral side, and that's why we see larger activity on the right side when you stimulate to the left, and stimulation from the right gives you larger dipoles on the left cortex. Okay. Now, what happens with unilaterals? Actually, we see the same pattern, but this contralateral cortex, the left, has a significantly greater dipole response, and you can see that in the response here. So we thought, well, maybe that's because we have larger synchronous activity evoked by the electrical stimulation. However, that we discounted because when you provide 2 cochlear implants simultaneously, we actually don't see that. And we see much more normal patterns where stimulation from the right gives you larger activity on the left, stimulation on the left, larger activity on the right. When you provide the 2 cochlear implants with short delays within that period of brainstem development, now you see again very similar activity to normal. But if you wait until the brainstem is largely developed, now you have children who look more like a unilateral development. You have the very large, abnormally large activity in this contralateral left auditory cortex. And if you look at the newly implanted ear, even though that ear has been stimulated now for on average 3.5 years, we have a reversal of the pattern where now the ipsilateral cortex is the larger stimulated. Now, when I spoke to Andre about these data one day at a conference, which is why conferences are so important, he said, but you know, we look at this a little differently. We look to see if you're looking at one part of the brain and we ask which ear preferentially activates that side. And I said, you know, we can look at that too. So we did that, and we see, okay, normally we would expect the contralateral ear to preferentially stimulate that side of the brain. And we see that in all cases except for these children who were unilaterally stimulated beyond the brainstem developmental period, so that this first implanted side is now preferentially stimulating the ipsilateral cortex. So what this means now is we have this unilaterally stimulated ear that is strengthened pathway to the ipsilateral cortex as well as to the contralateral cortex. And we know from Andre Kral's data that this happened because we gave them cochlear implants, one, so early in life. So it wouldn't have happened if we'd left them deaf, but then they wouldn't be hearing. And it wouldn't have happened if we'd implanted late, but then we wouldn't have had good speech perception. So this is the result. We also found that as our cortical responses became more and more abnormal, so the speech perception in the second implanted ear also deteriorated, as well as the asymmetry between the 2 ears increased. And this is again a reflection of this asymmetry that we are causing by missing or stimulating the brainstem development by only one side. And I want to talk a little bit more about that speech perception. Here is just a huge amount of data that we collected from all of these groups that I've told you before. Children with 2 implants at the same time in these blue boxes, and you can see them mostly here when we are testing in quiet, have less asymmetry between the 2 sides, and short delay also. You can see the green box is a little bit more variable, but the long delay group have a huge amount of variability with more asymmetry. And here's another group with long periods of deafness. So they were later at the time of the first implant, as well as having a long delay. And you can see their data is also spread in here. And what we're showing here is that the asymmetry between the 2 ears has an effect on how these children use the 2 implants together relative to what they were using with 1 implant alone. So the benefit of the 2 implants. So I want to just deconstruct this data a little bit. If we focus just on children who have quite a lot of asymmetry in the speech perception performance between the 2 ears, 20% or more, you can see the data here. In quiet and in noise, the performance with 1 implant alone versus bilateral is no different in quiet. There is an advantage when noise is introduced, so that's good. There's no disadvantage. There is some advantage for these children of having 2 implants. But if we look now at children with less asymmetry in speech perception between the 2 ears, what you see now is the advantage is clearer, both in quiet and in noise, and that advantage is significantly greater, particularly in noise. So I want to leave you with this part saying that these short delays in giving the second implant have perceptual, functional effects. The last piece of data that I want to leave you with is that we can actually also miss a later sensitive period. I don't want you to think that having 1 implant is a terrible thing. We are actually stimulating a lot of cortical development with 1 cochlear implant. We are stimulating speech perception with one implant. And the evidence for that is here from Salima Jawani's work in my lab. If we equate implant use with hearing experience in normally hearing children, what you see is an emergence of similar cortical responses. So the red data is from cochlear implant users and the black from normally hearing users. This is the immature cortical response. And when you have now 7 to 12 years of hearing experience in these 2 groups, you can see an emergence of a middle, sort of a adolescent type of response, and then an emergence of a mature-like cortical response with over 12 years of hearing experience. With the one difference being this P2 response, and that we think reflects a difference in the need for attention in our cochlear implant users, and it's actually marked by longer reaction times in our cochlear implant users when they're listening, and we're looking at that. But what I want to show you is data from this group, because what we've done in this group is looked at the cortical responses in each hemisphere, as we did with the children who had more immature responses. And in fact, 26 of these children received a second implant very, very late, after they had mature cortical responses. So these are a different group. So I remind you that in the immature responses, Dan Wong's data showed this larger activity in the left auditory cortex, but with normal morphology in these 2 hemispheres. Salima Jawani is showing now for dipole moments, not just in the voxel with the largest signal-to-noise ratio, but in all 64,000 voxels that we can measure. And you can see the hot spots here in, again, the cortex contralateral to the side of unilateral stimulation. So that confirms the early work. But now, when we try to stimulate the second implanted ear, we get a completely different response. And it has bilateral activation and at some unique areas. And this response reminds us of a response that we reported on several years ago, which was negatively correlated with speech perception. The larger this response was, the worse the speech perception was. And in fact, these children do have very poor performance in that second implanted side. So what I think is happening here is, and this is now, I'm wrapping up, is that when we deny or we have a lack of access to binaural hearing, there's no inhibitory input, which allows stimulation from the first side to strengthen pathways both to the contralateral and ipsilateral cortex. And we have changes in the unstimulated pathways, which over time degenerate to such an effect by the time we have cortical development, we may not be able to restore sufficient speech perception. And what I want to leave you with is that imbalanced auditory input during sensitive periods in development distorts the symmetry, which I think is important for binaural hearing of the bilateral pathways. And also, I want you to think that there are multiple sensitive periods in hearing, in the development of hearing. In particular, we've talked about an early phase of bilateral development that's important prior to the maturation of the brainstem, which happens in the first years of stimulation, and a later phase, which I think ends with cortical maturation. So with that, I thank you once again for inviting me, and I would like to reciprocate and have you back to Toronto.